I documented every stranger's walking pattern in my neighborhood for a decade. It exposed my best friend's killer. I found Meredith's body on a Thursday morning in September, and within 6 hours I'd identified her killer through a walking pattern I documented 317 times over 3 years. My name is Isabel Byrne, and the police thought I was delusional when I told them the murderer had a distinctive limping gait and had violated his established route pattern on the morning she died. But I knew I was right because I'd spent 10 years cataloging every person who walked past my second-floor window, building a database that tracked routes, times, gaits, and frequencies of everyone in my 6-block radius. The documentation started as a coping mechanism for agoraphobia, something to focus on when leaving my apartment triggered panic attacks so severe I'd lost my job and most of my relationships. People called it obsessive, pathological, a waste of a life spent watching strangers instead of living my own. My boyfriend had left me over it. My family had given up on me. My therapist suggested I was using the documentation to avoid real treatment. Only Meredith never judged me, never treated my condition as a character flaw. She was a journalist who understood the value of observation, who brought me takeout twice a week and listened when I explained pedestrian traffic patterns. She was the only friend I had left, and someone had beaten her to death in the alley behind my building. The morning started normally. I was stationed at my window at 6:30, documenting the early walkers before the neighborhood fully woke. The mail carrier at 6:45, precise as always. The construction worker heading to the bus stop at 7:03, coffee cup in hand. The gray-suited businessman at 7:15, briefcase swinging with metronomic regularity. Then at 7:20, I saw him. Subject 847 in my database, male approximately 6 feet tall, distinctive limping gait favoring left leg, always wore dark clothing. But subject 847 walked past my window every Wednesday and Friday at 9:40 in the morning. This was Thursday, and he was here 3 hours early, moving quickly despite the limp, head down, hands shoved deep in jacket pockets. I grabbed my camera and photographed him, noting the timestamp and the radical deviation from his established pattern. He turned down the alley behind my building, the same alley where residents kept trash bins and where the building's back entrance was located. I logged it in my database with detailed notes about the anomaly, then continued my morning observations. At 9:15, I heard sirens. Police cars pulled up in front of my building, then an ambulance. I watched officers exit their vehicles and disappear around back toward the alley. My stomach clenched with instinctive dread. Meredith was supposed to arrive at 11:30 for lunch. We had plans to watch a documentary she'd been researching for an article about municipal corruption. When noon came and went with no message, I texted her 3 times. No response. At 12:40, someone knocked on my door hard enough to rattle the frame. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 police officers, a man and a woman in uniform. I opened the door with my heart hammering, already knowing something terrible had happened. The female officer was named Officer Denise Krakowski, and she asked if I was Isabel Byrne, if I knew Meredith Kwan. I said yes. She was my best friend. What happened? Officer Krakowski's expression was professionally sympathetic but direct. She said Meredith had been found in the alley behind my building at approximately 9:05 that morning. She'd been deceased for several hours, apparent homicide. The words hit me physically, my knees buckling. I grabbed the doorframe to stay upright. The male officer, Officer Leon Foster, asked if they could come inside, if I was okay to answer some questions. I let them in because my brain couldn't process refusal, couldn't process anything except the impossibility of Meredith being dead. She'd texted me the night before at 10:15 confirming our lunch plans, sending a joke about the documentary director's pretentious interview style. She couldn't be dead. Officer Krakowski asked when I'd last seen Meredith. I said Friday evening she'd brought Chinese food and we'd watched 2 episodes of a series about white-collar crime. She asked if Meredith had mentioned any threats, anyone who might want to hurt her. I said no, but her journalism work sometimes made people angry. She investigated corruption and exposed people who abused power. Officer Foster asked about my relationship with Meredith, whether we'd argued recently, whether anyone else had keys to my apartment. I understood then that I was being evaluated as a potential suspect, but I was too stunned to care about protecting myself. I told them Meredith was the only person who still visited me, who didn't treat me as broken, who understood that mental illness wasn't moral failure. Officer Krakowski asked about my mental illness, what diagnosis I had, what medications I took. I said generalized anxiety disorder with agoraphobic tendencies, that I rarely left my apartment, that I did freelance web design from home. Officer Foster asked what I'd been doing that morning between 6 and 9. I said I was at my window documenting walking patterns. They exchanged glances. Officer Krakowski asked me to elaborate. I explained my documentation system, how I'd spent 10 years cataloging every person who walked past my window, tracking their routes and patterns and frequencies. Officer Foster's expression shifted to skepticism bordering on concern, probably wondering if they were interviewing a witness or someone who needed psychiatric evaluation. I showed them my database, my notebooks, my photographs. Thousands of entries spanning a decade, detailed logs of hundreds of individuals, route maps and frequency analysis and gait descriptions. Officer Krakowski asked if I'd noticed anything unusual that morning, anyone suspicious near the building. I said yes. Subject 847 had violated his established pattern, appearing on Thursday morning at 7:20, when he only ever walked past on Wednesday and Friday at 9:40. I showed them his database entry, the 317 previous observations, the photographs documenting his distinctive limping gait. I showed them that morning's photograph of him turning into the alley where Meredith was found, timestamp 7:23. Officer Foster asked if I knew this person's name, where he lived, anything about his identity. I said no, I only documented walking patterns. I didn't interact with subjects or investigate their personal information. Officer Krakowski asked why I'd specifically noted him among hundreds of other people. I said because his pattern was extremely consistent, and any deviation from established patterns was statistically significant. This morning's appearance was a 6 sigma event, meaning the probability of random occurrence was essentially 0. Officer Foster asked what that meant in non-statistical terms. I said it meant Subject 847 had deliberately altered his routine, and given that Meredith was killed in the alley he'd walked into, the correlation was too strong to ignore. Officer Krakowski took my phone and had me send her all the photographs of Subject 847. She said they'd investigate this lead but warned me not to conduct my own investigation or approach this individual if I saw him again. Officer Foster asked if I'd be willing to come to the station for a formal statement. I said I couldn't, that leaving my apartment triggered severe panic attacks, that I hadn't been outside in 4 months. He said they might need me to testify if the case went to trial, asked if I'd be able to do that. I said I didn't know, that testifying in court would require leaving my apartment and being in a room full of strangers, which might be physically impossible for me. Officer Krakowski's expression softened slightly. She said they'd work with me on accommodations if necessary, but right now they needed to pursue all leads. They left, and I collapsed on my couch shaking uncontrollably, the reality of Meredith's death finally penetrating the shock. My best friend was dead. Someone had killed her behind my building while I'd been watching from my window. If I'd been looking at the right moment, if I'd happened to glance at the alley instead of cataloging other subjects, could I have seen it happening? Could I have called for help in time? The guilt was suffocating, mixing with grief until I couldn't distinguish one from the other. I'd spent a decade watching strangers instead of living my life, and the one person who'd stayed in my life had been murdered meters from where I sat. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I pulled up every photograph I had of Subject 847, studying his face and gait and clothing for any detail that might help identify him. In my 3 years of documenting him, I'd captured his face clearly in 41 photographs. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, weathered features, dark hair graying at temples, always wore dark jeans and either black or navy jackets. The limp was pronounced but didn't seem to slow him significantly, suggesting an old injury rather than ongoing disability. His route was precise, walking east on Callahan Street, turning north on 8th Avenue, disappearing from my sightline near the corner market. Every Wednesday and Friday at 9:40, without deviation, for 3 years. Until Thursday morning when he'd appeared 3 hours early and turned into the alley where Meredith died. I mapped his usual route, cross-referencing it with every other subject in my database to see if anyone else followed similar patterns. 3 other individuals used portions of the same route, but none with his consistency or distinctive gait. I compiled a report documenting everything I knew about Subject 847, including frequency analysis, route maps, all photographs, and the statistical improbability of his Thursday morning appearance. I emailed it to Officer Krakowski at midnight, unable to do nothing while Meredith's killer potentially walked free. The next morning, Detective Valerie Orozco called me. She was the lead investigator on Meredith's case, and she wanted to discuss my documentation system in detail. She asked if she could come to my apartment rather than requiring me to visit the station, acknowledging my condition. I agreed, grateful not to have to force myself outside during the worst emotional crisis of my life. Detective Orozco arrived at 10 with a younger detective named Thomas Nguyen. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and direct, and she spent 20 minutes reviewing my database while asking precise questions about my methodology. She asked how I could be certain about Subject 847's pattern consistency, whether I'd ever missed days of observation. I said I documented every day unless I was physically ill, that I had 10 years of continuous records with fewer than 30 missed days total. She asked if anyone else knew about my documentation system. I said my ex-boyfriend, my family, my therapist, and Meredith. Everyone except Meredith thought it was pathological. Detective Orozco said pathological or not, I'd created a surveillance system that captured details most people never noticed. She asked me to walk through the morning of Meredith's death minute by minute, describing everyone I'd documented. I pulled up my logs and described each person who'd passed my window between 6 and 9 that morning. 23 individuals total, all but Subject 847 following their established patterns. Detective Orozco asked about the medical examiner's preliminary timeline. She said Meredith had been killed between 7 and 8:30 that morning, beaten severely enough to cause fatal head trauma. The attack appeared to be targeted rather than random, with evidence suggesting Meredith knew her attacker and had met him willingly in the alley. Detective Nguyen asked if Meredith had mentioned meeting anyone that morning. I said no. She'd planned to come directly to my apartment at 11:30. Detective Orozco asked about Meredith's journalism work, whether she'd mentioned any dangerous investigations or people who'd threatened her. I said she'd been working on a story about housing fraud, something involving landlords illegally displacing tenants and selling properties under false pretenses. She'd mentioned one landlord in particular who'd been aggressive when she'd contacted him for comment, a man named Gerald Sutton who owned multiple properties in our neighborhood. Detective Orozco wrote the name down. She asked if I'd ever documented Gerald Sutton walking past my window. I searched my database and found no entries for that name, but I explained that I only had names for people I'd specifically identified, that most subjects were cataloged by physical characteristics and pattern data rather than identity. Detective Orozco asked to see all my photographs of subject 847 again. She studied each image carefully, then showed one to Detective Nguyen. They conferred quietly before Detective Orozco asked if I'd ever seen subject 847 interact with anyone during his walks. I said no. He always walked alone, never stopped to talk to people, kept his head down and moved with purpose. She asked if I'd noticed him carrying anything unusual, any packages or bags. I reviewed my notes and said he occasionally carried a newspaper under his arm, but never bags or packages. Detective Orozco said they were running the photographs through facial recognition and checking them against known offenders and persons of interest. She asked if I'd be willing to work with a police sketch artist to create a detailed description. I said yes, though I pointed out my photographs were higher quality than any sketch could be. She agreed, but said procedural documentation required multiple forms of identification evidence. Before they left, Detective Orozco said something that chilled me. She said Meredith had been carrying a folder when she was killed, containing documents related to her housing fraud investigation. The folder was missing from the scene, suggesting the motive was related to her journalism work rather than random violence. Someone had killed her to stop a story. Over the next week, I learned more about Meredith's investigation than she'd shared while alive. The Tribune ran a memorial piece describing her work, including her current project exposing a landlord who'd displaced over 60 low-income families through fraudulent eviction notices and building code violations he'd invented. The landlord was Gerald Sutton, the same name I'd mentioned to Detective Orozco. The article said Meredith had been close to publishing her exposé, that she'd gathered extensive evidence of Sutton's illegal practices and had scheduled an interview with city officials about enforcement failures. The article included Sutton's photograph. I stared at it for several minutes, certain I'd seen him before, but unable to place where. Then I searched my database using physical characteristics from the photo. Male, mid-40s, 6 feet tall, dark hair. The search returned 47 possible matches. I reviewed each one systematically, comparing facial features visible in my photographs to Sutton's published image. On the 32nd comparison, I found him. Subject 291, documented 163 times over 7 years. He walked past my window every Monday, Thursday, and Saturday at 8:15 in the morning, heading west on Callahan Street. Regular as clockwork. But he wasn't subject 847, the man with the limping gait who'd appeared in the alley the morning Meredith died. I called Detective Orozco immediately and told her Gerald Sutton was in my database as a regular pedestrian, but he wasn't the subject who'd violated his pattern the morning of the murder. She asked me to send her all documentation of Sutton's walking patterns. I compiled it within an hour, showing 7 years of regular Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday appearances at 8:15, always walking west, presumably toward one of his properties or a business office. Detective Orozco said they were investigating Sutton as a primary suspect based on the missing folder and his motive to stop Meredith's exposé, but so far they had no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. She asked if I'd ever photographed Sutton interacting with anyone who might be subject 847. I spent 4 hours cross-referencing every photograph I had of Sutton with every photograph of subject 847, looking for any overlap or connection. I found nothing. The two men appeared in my documentation across different time periods and routes, with no evidence they'd ever been in the same location simultaneously. But that didn't mean they didn't know each other. If Sutton had hired someone to kill Meredith, he'd be smart enough to avoid public association with that person. Detective Orozco brought me to the station 2 weeks after Meredith's death. It required 2 anxiety medications and 3 hours of breathing exercises before I could force myself into the car, my first time leaving my apartment in 5 months. The station was overwhelming, fluorescent lights and raised voices and too many people moving through cramped spaces. Detective Orozco led me to a quiet interview room and had me sit with my back to the wall facing the door, minimizing triggers. She showed me a series of photographs, asking if I recognized anyone. The 5th photograph was subject 847. I identified him immediately, describing the limping gait and route pattern. Detective Orozco said his name was Kenneth Vera, and he had a prior conviction for assault from 12 years ago. His left leg had been shattered in a motorcycle accident 8 years ago, which explained the distinctive limp. He worked as a maintenance contractor for several property management companies in the area, including companies that managed buildings owned by Gerald Sutton. The connection between Sutton and Vera wasn't direct employment, but they operated in overlapping professional circles. Detective Orozco said Vera had an alibi for the morning of the murder, claiming he'd been at a property on the other side of the city performing emergency repairs. The property owner confirmed Vera had been there, but the timeline was vague enough that he could have killed Meredith and still made it to the job site by 9:30. Detective Nguyen brought in a laptop and showed me surveillance footage from a corner market 2 blocks from my apartment, timestamped 7:18 on the morning of Meredith's death. The video showed Kenneth Vera walking east, heading in the direction of my building. I confirmed it was definitely him, the limping gait unmistakable. Detective Orozco said they'd found no surveillance footage showing him leaving the area, which suggested he'd taken a different route or had been picked up by vehicle. They'd searched his apartment and found nothing connecting him directly to Meredith's murder. No stolen items from the scene, no evidence of her blood or DNA. But they'd found something else. A burner phone with text messages between Vera and an unnamed contact, discussing payment for handling a problem and making sure the reporter doesn't publish. The messages were coded but clearly implied a hired killing. The phone number for the contact led to another burner phone that had been destroyed, but cell tower data placed that phone in proximity to Gerald Sutton's primary residence. It wasn't enough for an arrest warrant yet, but it established a likely conspiracy between Sutton and Vera. Detective Orozco asked if I'd be willing to testify about Vera's pattern deviation and his presence in the alley the morning of the murder. I said yes, if they could make accommodations for my condition. She said they'd request permission for me to testify via video link if necessary, that my agoraphobia was a recognized disability protected under federal law. 3 weeks after Meredith's death, police arrested Gerald Sutton and Kenneth Vera on conspiracy to commit murder charges. The district attorney announced they'd be seeking first-degree murder charges once additional evidence was processed. The arrest was covered extensively by local media, including the Tribune, which published a lengthy piece about Meredith's investigation and the corruption she died trying to expose. The article described how Sutton had used fraudulent eviction notices and invented building violations to force low-income tenants from rent-controlled apartments, then sold the buildings at enormous profit after emptying them. Meredith had documented over 60 families who'd been illegally displaced, many of them elderly or disabled people who'd lost their homes with nowhere to go. She'd obtained internal company documents showing Sutton knew the evictions were illegal, that he'd specifically instructed his employees to target tenants who were unlikely to have resources to fight back legally. When Meredith had contacted Sutton for comment, he'd threatened to sue her and the Tribune for defamation. 2 days later, he'd contacted Kenneth Vera about handling a problem. The timeline suggested premeditated murder rather than a crime of passion or impulse. Sutton had deliberately arranged Meredith's death to stop her from destroying his criminal enterprise. The Tribune published Meredith's complete investigation posthumously, dedicating an entire Sunday edition to the story she'd died reporting. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for January, 4 months after Meredith's death. I spent those months in intensive therapy, working with a specialist in exposure therapy to prepare for the possibility of in-person testimony. My therapist, Dr. Rebecca Holt, said testifying against Meredith's killers might provide closure, but only if I could manage it without traumatizing myself further. We did graduated exposure exercises, starting with me sitting in my building's hallway for 5 minutes, then walking to the corner, then riding in cars for increasing durations. It was agonizing work, every exposure triggering panic symptoms I had to endure rather than escape. But the thought of Sutton and Vera walking free because I couldn't testify was more terrifying than the panic itself. Meredith had been my best friend, my only friend, the person who'd validated my existence when everyone else had given up on me. I owed her justice, even if achieving it destroyed what little stability I'd maintained. Dr. Holt helped me develop coping strategies for courtroom testimony, focusing on the prosecutor's questions, visualizing Meredith's face when anxiety peaked, remembering that my documentation system had value regardless of how pathological others found it. The defense attorneys would attack my credibility, suggest my mental illness made me an unreliable witness, argue that my decade of observation was evidence of dysfunction rather than expertise. I had to be prepared for that assault while maintaining composure. The district attorney was a focused woman named Margaret Donnelly who'd built her career on corruption cases. She met with me several times to prepare my testimony, reviewing every detail of my documentation system and Subject 847's pattern deviation. She said the defense would argue that my observations were meaningless, that correlation wasn't causation, that Vera's presence in the area didn't prove he'd killed Meredith. I needed to explain the statistical significance of his pattern deviation, the improbability of coincidence given his established behavior over 3 years. Margaret said my documentation was actually more reliable than traditional eyewitness testimony because it was systematic rather than based on memory, that I had photographs and timestamps and detailed logs rather than subjective impressions. She said juries often struggled with statistical evidence, that I needed to make the pattern analysis accessible to people without mathematical background. I practiced explaining my methodology in plain language, describing how 317 consistent observations established a baseline that made Thursday morning's deviation statistically extraordinary. Margaret said if I could clearly convey that Subject 847 had never deviated from his Wednesday-Friday 9:40 pattern in 3 years until the morning Meredith died, the jury would understand the significance. The preliminary hearing arrived. I took medication and forced myself into the car with Dr. Holt accompanying me for support. The courthouse was massive and overwhelming, security checkpoints and metal detectors and crowds of people. I made it to the designated witness room where I could wait in relative quiet. Margaret came by to check on me, saying the hearing was going well, that the judge was taking the evidence seriously. When I was called to testify, Dr. Holt walked me to the courtroom door. I entered a wood-paneled room filled with strangers, the judge elevated at his bench, lawyers at their tables, defendants in orange jumpsuits. Kenneth Vera sat at the defense table looking smaller than he had in my photographs, his limp invisible while seated. Gerald Sutton sat beside him in an expensive suit, his expression arrogant and contemptuous. I was sworn in and took the witness stand, my heart rate probably hitting 180, spots dancing in my peripheral vision. Margaret approached with a kind expression and asked me to state my name and describe my documentation system. I explained the 10 years of observation, the database tracking hundreds of pedestrians, my focus on pattern analysis and route consistency. Margaret showed the court examples of my documentation, photographs and logs demonstrating systematic methodology. She asked if I'd noticed anything unusual on the morning of September 19th. I described subject 847's appearance at 7:20 on Thursday, violating his established Wednesday-Friday 9:40 pattern for the first time in 3 years. Margaret asked me to explain the statistical significance. I said that with 317 observations establishing consistent behavior, the probability of random pattern deviation was less than 0.03%. The Thursday appearance represented a deliberate choice to alter his routine, not random variation. Margaret asked if I'd seen subject 847 enter the alley where Meredith Kwan was found. I said yes. I'd photographed him turning into the alley at 7:23, and he'd been in the alley during the medical examiner's established time of death. Margaret asked if I could identify subject 847 in the courtroom. I pointed to Kenneth Vera. She asked how certain I was. I said absolutely certain. His limping gait was distinctive, and I'd documented him over 300 times. His face and movement pattern were unmistakable. Margaret showed the court my photograph of Vera entering the alley, timestamp visible. She asked if I'd seen him leave. I said no. My window didn't provide visibility to the alley exit. I'd continued documenting other subjects after he disappeared from view. Margaret asked if I'd documented Gerald Sutton. I said yes. Subject 291, 163 observations over 7 years. But Sutton followed a different route pattern and hadn't appeared the morning of the murder. Margaret thanked me and returned to her seat. The defense attorney was a slick man named Harold Perkins who looked at me with barely concealed disdain. He asked about my mental health history, my agoraphobia, the medications I took. He asked if I'd ever been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons. I said no. He asked if my therapist had diagnosed me with obsessive-compulsive disorder. I said no. My diagnosis was generalized anxiety disorder with agoraphobic tendencies. He asked if watching strangers from my window for 10 years seemed like normal, healthy behavior to me. Margaret objected, arguing the question was irrelevant and prejudicial. The judge sustained the objection. Perkins asked how many people I'd documented over the decade. I said 832 individuals with sufficient frequency to establish patterns. He asked if I'd ever interacted with any of these people, if I knew their names or stories or anything about their lives. I said no. I only documented observable behavior. He suggested this made me a stalker rather than a reliable witness. Margaret objected again. The judge sustained. Perkins asked how I could be certain the man in my photograph was his client. I said the limping gait was unique. The facial features matched across hundreds of photographs. The probability of misidentification was essentially 0. He said essentially 0 wasn't actually 0, that I couldn't prove beyond doubt that the blurry figure in my photograph was Kenneth Vera. I said the photograph wasn't blurry. I'd used a telephoto lens and the image quality was excellent. Anyone could see it was the same person. Perkins showed the court several of my photographs of Vera, asking why some were clearer than others, suggesting my equipment was unreliable. I explained that image clarity depended on distance, lighting conditions, and movement speed, that some variation was normal but didn't negate identification. He asked if I'd ever made mistakes in my identifications. I said rarely, usually when subjects wore heavy winter clothing that obscured their features, but I'd never misidentified someone I'd documented hundreds of times. He asked if my agoraphobia affected my judgment or perception. I said no. My anxiety disorder affected my ability to leave my apartment, not my cognitive function or observational accuracy. He asked if I'd ever had hallucinations or delusions. Margaret objected strenuously. The judge sustained and warned Perkins about improper questioning. Perkins asked if anyone could verify my claims about subject 847's pattern consistency. I said my database was independently verifiable, that the timestamps and photographs provided objective documentation. He said objective documentation created by someone with acknowledged mental illness, spending 10 years obsessively watching strangers. Margaret objected. The judge sustained and admonished Perkins about attacking the witness rather than the testimony. Perkins had no further questions. I was excused and returned to the witness room, shaking but proud I'd maintained composure. Dr. Holt said I'd done exceptionally well, that my testimony had been clear and credible despite the defense attorney's attempts to undermine me. The hearing continued for 3 more days with additional witnesses. The medical examiner testified about Meredith's injuries and time of death. Detective Orozco testified about the investigation, the burner phone messages, the connection between Sutton and Vera. A forensic analyst testified about cell tower data placing Vera in the area during the murder, and Sutton's phone in contact with Vera's burner phone before and after. One of Sutton's former employees testified that Sutton had specifically mentioned Meredith Kwan as a threat to his business, that he'd said she needed to be stopped permanently. The employee had interpreted this as bluster until after the murder, then had contacted police. The judge ruled there was sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial on first-degree murder charges for both defendants. Bail was denied given the severity of charges and flight risk. I felt relief mixed with dread, knowing I'd have to testify again at trial, that the defense would have more time to prepare attacks on my credibility. But Meredith's killers were being held accountable, and my decade of documentation had been crucial to that accountability. My so-called pathological hobby had exposed a murder conspiracy that might otherwise have been unsolved. The trial was scheduled for May, 5 months away. Margaret Donnelly contacted me regularly to prepare, reviewing potential defense strategies and helping me strengthen my testimony. She said the defense would likely bring in psychiatric experts to question my reliability, would argue that my observation system was too abnormal to be trusted. I needed expert witnesses of my own to validate my methodology. Margaret connected me with a forensic psychologist named Dr. Anya Volkov, who specialized in pattern recognition and observational accuracy. Dr. Volkov spent hours reviewing my documentation system, testing my ability to identify subjects from photographs, analyzing my accuracy rates. She concluded that my pattern analysis was actually more reliable than average eyewitness identification because it was systematic, repeated, and photographically documented, rather than based on single brief observations. She said my agoraphobia was irrelevant to my observational accuracy, that mental illness affecting spatial behavior didn't impair visual perception or analytical thinking. She agreed to testify as an expert witness, validating my methodology. Margaret also recruited a statistician named Dr. James Rothstein, who analyzed my data and confirmed that subject 847's Thursday morning appearance represented a 6 sigma deviation from established pattern, meaning the probability of random occurrence was 1 in 500 million. He'd testified that this level of deviation indicated deliberate behavioral change, not coincidence. Meredith's family reached out to me during this period. Her parents, Thomas and Linda Kwan, invited me to their home for dinner. It required enormous effort to leave my apartment and enter their space, but I forced myself because they deserved to meet the person who'd helped catch their daughter's killers. They were gracious and heartbroken, showing me photographs of Meredith as a child and teenager, telling stories about her determination and compassion. Linda cried, talking about how Meredith had always stood up for people others ignored, how she'd pursued journalism because she believed the truth mattered. Thomas thanked me for refusing to let the police dismiss my observations, for persisting even when authorities doubted me. He said Meredith had mentioned me often, had talked about my documentation system with admiration rather than concern, had said I saw things others missed because I actually paid attention. Linda asked if they could do anything to help me, whether I needed support preparing for trial. I said no, that knowing Meredith's family supported me was enough. They hugged me when I left, and Linda whispered that Meredith would be proud of my courage. That sentiment stayed with me through the difficult months of trial preparation. The trial began on a Monday in May. The courtroom was packed with reporters and observers, Meredith's case having attracted significant media attention. Gerald Sutton had hired expensive defense attorneys who'd argued aggressively at every pretrial hearing, trying to suppress evidence and exclude witnesses. Kenneth Vera still had a public defender, a competent but overwhelmed young woman named Angela Frost who seemed resigned to losing. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. Margaret Donnelly described Meredith Kwan as a dedicated journalist exposing corruption at great personal risk, a woman who'd died because she threatened a landlord's criminal enterprise. She described Gerald Sutton as a predator who'd built his wealth by destroying vulnerable families, who'd ordered Meredith's murder to protect his profits. She described Kenneth Vera as a hired killer who'd carried out that murder with cold efficiency. She told the jury they'd hear testimony from dozens of witnesses, including forensic experts, investigators, victims of Sutton's fraud schemes, and a woman whose decade of careful observation had documented the killer's presence at the crime scene. She said the evidence would prove beyond reasonable doubt that both men had conspired to murder Meredith Kwan and deserved conviction on all charges. The defense opening statements tried different strategies. Vera's attorney Angela Frost argued that her client had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, that his presence in the area didn't prove he'd killed anyone, that the prosecution's case relied on circumstantial evidence and the questionable testimony of a mentally ill witness. Sutton's lead attorney Richard Kavanaugh argued that his client was a successful businessman being scapegoated by prosecutors who wanted a high-profile conviction, that the burner phone evidence was thin, that Sutton had no direct connection to the murder. Both attorneys suggested alternative suspects and planted doubt about the investigation's thoroughness. The prosecution called witnesses systematically over 2 weeks. Tenants displaced by Sutton's fraud described receiving false eviction notices and invented building violations. City officials testified about complaints against Sutton that had been ignored due to his political connections. Meredith's editor at the Tribune testified about her investigation and the threats she'd received. The medical examiner testified about her injuries and time of death. Detective Orozco testified about the investigation, walking the jury through evidence collection and analysis. The forensic analyst testified about the burner phone messages and cell tower data. Each witness built on the last, creating an overwhelming picture of premeditated conspiracy. I testified on the 12th day. I was better prepared than at the preliminary hearing, more familiar with the courtroom environment, supported by Dr. Holt's presence and medication. Margaret led me through my testimony methodically, establishing my documentation system, my database, my 3 years of observing subject 847. She showed the jury examples of my logs and photographs, demonstrating systematic methodology. She asked me to explain Kenneth Vieira's pattern and his Thursday morning deviation. I described the 317 previous observations, all following the same Wednesday-Friday 9:40 pattern, making Thursday's 7:20 appearance an unprecedented anomaly. Margaret showed the jury my photograph of Vieira entering the alley where Meredith was found, timestamp clearly visible. She asked about my certainty of identification. I said absolutely certain. His limping gait and facial features were unmistakable. I documented him hundreds of times. Dr. Volkov testified next, validating my methodology and accuracy. She explained that systematic repeated observation was more reliable than single-event eyewitness testimony, that my documentation provided objective evidence rather than subjective memory. Dr. Rothstein testified about the statistical significance of the pattern deviation, explaining 6 sigma probability in terms the jury could understand. The prosecution rested, having built an overwhelming case. The defense called their witnesses. A forensic expert argued that my photographs weren't clear enough for definitive identification, though his opinion was undermined when the jury viewed the high-resolution images. A psychiatrist testified that agoraphobia often coincided with paranoid thinking, and that my documentation system could represent delusional behavior. Dr. Volkov had prepared me for this attack, and on cross-examination, Margaret destroyed the psychiatrist's credibility by forcing him to admit he'd never evaluated me personally, had never reviewed my actual documentation, and was speculating rather than providing expert opinion. Sutton's attorneys called character witnesses describing him as a generous community member and successful businessman. Margaret shredded their testimony by showing evidence of Sutton's fraud schemes and illegal evictions. Kenneth Vieira's attorney called the property owner who'd claimed Vieira was at a job site the morning of the murder, but Margaret's cross-examination revealed the timeline was vague and could accommodate a detour to kill Meredith. Neither defendant testified, their attorneys recognizing the prosecution would destroy them under cross-examination. The defense rested after 4 days, their case weak against the weight of evidence. Closing arguments were powerful. Margaret Donnelly summarized the evidence systematically, showing how every piece connected to prove conspiracy and murder. She described Meredith Kwan's dedication to exposing corruption, her bravery in confronting powerful criminals, her death at age 32 because she'd threatened Gerald Sutton's illegal empire. She described how Sutton had ordered the murder and Vieira had carried it out, how they'd communicated through burner phones and thought they'd get away with it. She described how Isabel Byrne's documentation system had exposed their crime, how a woman's society dismissed as mentally ill had seen patterns trained investigators missed. She told the jury that Meredith deserved justice, that the 60 families Sutton had displaced deserved accountability, that convicting both defendants was the only moral outcome. The defense closing arguments felt desperate. Vieira's attorney argued reasonable doubt, suggesting alternative explanations that seemed implausible given the evidence. Sutton's attorney argued lack of direct proof, claiming the burner phone messages were ambiguous. Neither attorney could overcome the systematic case the prosecution had built. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days. When they returned, both defendants were found guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. I didn't attend, unable to force myself into the courthouse again, but Margaret called me immediately after. Kenneth Vieira received life imprisonment without parole. Gerald Sutton received life imprisonment without parole plus additional years for conspiracy charges. Both men showed no remorse at sentencing, maintaining their innocence despite overwhelming evidence. The judge's statement was scathing, describing their crimes as particularly heinous because they'd murdered a journalist for exposing truth, because they'd prioritized profit over human life and justice. Meredith's parents gave victim impact statements describing their daughter's life and the devastation of losing her. Thomas Kwan specifically mentioned my role in the investigation, saying that Meredith had been right to believe I saw things others missed, that my careful observation had ensured her killers faced justice. The Tribune published a comprehensive article about the trial and convictions, including a profile of me and my documentation system. The article described my agoraphobia not as a limitation, but as context for how I developed such detailed observational skills, framing my decade of documentation as valuable rather than pathological. The publicity was uncomfortable but validating, proof that my so-called obsession had genuine purpose. My life changed after the trial. The Philadelphia Police Department offered me a paid consultant position analyzing pedestrian and vehicle patterns for unsolved cases. I accepted, finally having legitimate work that utilized my skills. I consulted on 17 cases over the following year, identifying pattern anomalies that led to 4 additional arrests. My database became recognized as a valuable investigative resource. Mental health advocates contacted me about speaking publicly about anxiety disorders and agoraphobia, about how accommodation rather than judgment enabled people with mental illness to contribute meaningfully. I did several interviews trying to destigmatize conditions that society treated as character flaws. My relationship with my family improved dramatically. My parents apologized for dismissing my documentation as pathological, rather than recognizing it as a valid coping mechanism and genuine skill. My sister visited regularly, bringing her daughter, my niece, who thought my pattern analysis was fascinating rather than weird. Dr. Holt helped me continue exposure therapy, and I gradually expanded my ability to leave my apartment, though I'd never be someone comfortable in crowds or unfamiliar spaces. I started a blog about pattern recognition and observational methodology that gained following among law enforcement and psychology professionals. The work was meaningful in ways I'd never experienced before. 2 years after Meredith's death, the Tribune established the Meredith Kwan Memorial Journalism Award for reporters pursuing corruption investigations at personal risk. The first award ceremony was held at the newspaper's headquarters, and Meredith's parents invited me to attend. It required medication and Dr. Holt's accompaniment, but I forced myself to go, wanting to honor my friend's memory. The ceremony was beautiful and heartbreaking, celebrating Meredith's courage while acknowledging her terrible loss. Linda and Thomas Kwan spoke about their daughter's belief that journalism could change the world, that exposing truth was worth personal sacrifice. They presented the first award to a young reporter investigating police misconduct, someone whose work continued Meredith's legacy. After the ceremony, Linda pulled me aside and gave me a gift, a leather journal Meredith had kept. Inside were her notes from various investigations, including her housing fraud research. On the last page, dated 2 days before her death, Meredith had written about me. She'd described my documentation system as brilliant, said I had a gift for seeing patterns others missed, that society's dismissal of my work reflected its failure to value different types of intelligence. She'd written that she hoped someday I'd be recognized for the genuinely valuable skills I possessed, rather than judged for the anxiety disorder that had shaped how I developed those skills. Reading those words destroyed me and healed me simultaneously. Meredith had believed in me when nobody else did, had seen value where others saw only dysfunction. 3 years after solving Meredith's murder, I've consulted on 43 criminal cases and helped achieve 12 convictions. My database now contains documentation of over 1,000 individuals across a 15-block radius, having expanded my observation range as my anxiety improved. I've testified in 6 trials, my credibility as a pattern analysis expert now established. I'm teaching workshops for law enforcement about observational methodology and systematic documentation. I've published academic papers about pattern recognition and reliability of systematic observation versus traditional eyewitness testimony. My work is cited in forensic psychology courses. I've started dating someone I met through the police department, another analyst who understands dedicated focus on detail. I still spend hours at my window documenting walking patterns, but now it's recognized as valuable expertise rather than dismissed as pathological obsession. Gerald Sutton and Kenneth Vera remain in prison serving life sentences, and 60 displaced families received restitution through a civil settlement against Sutton's estate. Meredith Kwan's investigative work was published as a book that became required reading in journalism schools. Her legacy lives on through reporters continuing her work exposing corruption and abuse of power. I keep Meredith's photograph on my desk beside my computer where I maintain my database, a reminder that my decade of observation had purpose beyond managing my anxiety. When Subject 847 violated his established pattern on the morning she died, my documentation system provided the evidence that exposed her killers. The hobby that cost me relationships and normalcy and social acceptance became the key that unlocked justice for my best friend. Kenneth Vera and Gerald Sutton thought they'd been clever, using burner phones and maintaining plausible deniability. But they didn't account for a woman at a window who'd spent 10 years memorizing how people walked, who noticed when someone appeared at the wrong time on the wrong day. Meredith was right that I saw things others missed, and when it mattered most, those observations ensured her killers faced the consequences they deserved. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too, so subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.